All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep on something, well, pretty intense, but also really important, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant. We're talking about the Bhopal gas tragedy and hazardous waste here in India.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that touches on so much of what you need to know for the exams, environment, disaster management, industrial regulations, even public health.
It really does. And to kick things off, here's something that'll really grab you. Over 5,000 people died because of the Bhopal gas tragedy. More than 500,000 were poisoned. It's a lot to unpack. We're going to try to do that today using these excerpts from pasted text.
December 2nd, 1984, that's when it happened. The Bhopal gas tragedy. It's considered the worst industrial disaster, well, ever. And it all went down at this pesticide plant, the Union Carbide India Limited plant. UCIL, they called it.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. What actually went wrong at UCIL?
It was a leak, a gas leak. Methyl isocyanate, MIC for short, and it just spread through the whole city of Bhopal. People got sick immediately, and the long-term effects, well, they were devastating.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of suffering. Was this a total freak accident, or were there, hints that something was wrong?
And that's the really troubling part. It wasn't some isolated incident. There were reports years before the tragedy of other leaks. Phosgene, MIC, both of them. It's almost like, well, negligence, you could say. They just ignored the warning signs.
So instead of fixing things, it sounds like they swept it under the rug.
Pretty much. And for those of you studying for UPSC, this is huge. It's all about accountability, strict regulations, especially when you're dealing with hazardous materials.
For sure. You can almost bet there will be questions about corporate responsibility and government oversight in the mains exam. Let's talk about the effects of this tragedy, the health impacts. What were people experiencing right away?
It was bad. Immediately, people had trouble breathing, intense pain in their abdomen, their eyes burning and irritated, even problems with their nervous system. It was awful.
And were there long-term consequences too?
Sadly, yeah. The long-term consequences, those were even worse. People with decreased lung function, genetic abnormalities that, well, they got passed down, increased rates of miscarriages, higher infant mortality rates.
It's hard to hear, honestly, to think about one event having such a ripple effect, not just on individuals, but on families, future generations. What about the response from the government and legal system? How did they handle it?
Well, the Indian government, they passed the Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act in 1985. That was to help with compensation and legal representation for the victims. They needed a streamlined process, so that's what they did.
What about UCIL? Did they take any responsibility?
Initially, they offered $5 million in relief.
Seriously, 5 million for something this huge.
Right. It was nothing compared to the damage. The Indian government saw that and they pushed for more, like way more. 3.3 billion dollars.
So did they ever come to an agreement?
Yeah. After years in court, they settled out of court in '89 for 470 million dollars.
Still a lot less than the government wanted, though.
It is. And to make matters worse, 7 Indian nationals working for UCIL were convicted of causing death by negligence in 2010. But then they got bail immediately. A lot of the survivors, their families, they felt like true justice was never served.
It's tough. Even with laws in place, getting real accountability and justice, it can be so difficult, especially in a case this complicated. And even decades later, Bhopal still casts such a long shadow.
Absolutely. Many survivors, they're still struggling to get proper health care. And there's still the threat of toxic materials at the factory site. It's abandoned now. It really leads us to a bigger discussion about hazardous waste management in India as a huge challenge. But before we get into all of that, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Methyl isocyanate. What is it? What makes it so dangerous? That's where we need to start. So methyl isocyanate, MIC. What is this stuff?
Yeah, break it down for us. What makes it so dangerous?
Okay, so MIC, it's a colorless liquid, mostly used to make pesticides. And the thing is, it's really reactive, like especially to heat.
So was it heat that caused some kind of explosion at that UCL plant?
Not exactly an explosion, not like you'd think. The real danger with MIC is how it reacts with water. When those two mix, the compounds in it start reacting with each other, creating a ton of heat really fast. That leads to a pressure buildup, and that's probably what did it in Bhopal.
That makes sense. So is MIC still used today? Or have they, gotten rid of it because it's so risky?
You might be surprised, but MIC isn't produced anymore. But there's still some out there in pesticide stockpiles. The craziest part, there's only one place in the world that stores it now. Just one.
Whoa, really? Where is that?
It's at this Bayer crop science plant in West Virginia, in the U.S. The fact that there's only one place storing this stuff, that tells you just how dangerous it is to handle.
It definitely shows how important it is to be careful with hazardous materials. So let's zoom out a bit. What about hazardous waste in general? How do we even define that?
Hazardous waste, it's basically any waste that's a big threat to us or to the environment. Think toxic, flammable, really reactive or corrosive stuff.
So it's more than just stuff from factories, right? Are there other sources of hazardous waste we might not think about?
You're right. It's not just industrial byproducts. It can come from a lot of places, actually. Chemicals are a big one, obviously. But there's also inefficient technology used by small and medium businesses. Those often generate a ton of hazardous waste.
So even smaller companies are part of the problem. What about things we use every day at home? Can those be hazardous waste too?
Absolutely. Even treating wastewater or emissions from different processes that can leave behind residues with hazardous substances. And remember, the Bhopal tragedy.
Yeah, of course.
Well, that factory site, the UCIL one, it's abandoned now. But there's still hazardous waste there. It's a constant reminder of what happened. Which brings us to a big question. How's India dealing with all this hazardous waste? It's a growing problem.
Right. We definitely need a system to stop another Bhopal from happening. What does India's system look like? What are the rules?
The main thing is the Environment Protection Act of 1986, and under that act, they introduced the hazardous waste rules in '89. They've changed those rules a few times over the years to include more types of waste: e-waste, paper, metal scrap, even old tires.
So they're trying to keep up with all the new kinds of waste. What about working with other countries? Is India part of any global efforts on hazardous waste?
Definitely. India signed the Basel Convention back in 1992. That's a big deal. It shows they're serious about responsible waste management.
For those who don't know, what's the Basel Convention all about?
Basically, it's a treaty to control how hazardous waste moves between countries. They're trying to stop countries from dumping their waste in places that can't handle it safely.
That's really important, especially for developing countries that might get targeted. So how much hazardous waste are we talking about in India? How big is this problem?
India produces a lot of hazardous waste, around 7.66 million tons every year. It's like, imagine over 150,000 Boeing 747s fully loaded. That's how much hazardous waste India produces.
That's a crazy amount of waste. Where's most of it coming from?
Most of it, like 83%, comes from just 7 states: Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Odisha, and Chhattisgarh. They're big industrial hubs, so it makes sense.
Makes sense. What about the industries themselves? Which ones produce the most hazardous waste?
If you look at the data from 2016, it's mostly chemical production and metal processing. But we can't forget about the waste from treating wastewater and flue gases. That's a lot of waste, too.
So it's a lot of different industries contributing to the problem. How does India actually get rid of all this waste? What are the methods?
That's the million-dollar question. There are a few different ways they deal with hazardous waste in India. One that's becoming more common is called co-processing.
Co-processing. What's that?
It's basically using waste as fuel or raw materials in other industries, like recycling on a huge scale. For example, cement plants can use some industrial byproducts, even hazardous waste, in their process.
So it's like killing two birds with one stone. You reduce waste and maybe even save money.
Exactly. And it's catching on. About 25 cement plants in India are doing it now. Then there's material and energy recovery.
So instead of just throwing the waste away, you try to get something useful out of it?
Yeah, that's the idea. Material recovery is about getting valuable stuff out of the waste, like getting copper from cable scraps or lead from old batteries. Energy recovery is all about using waste as fuel.
Wait, you're saying some waste can actually be burned for energy? That's pretty cool.
It is. Things like used oil, solvents, some types of grease and wax, those can be burned as fuel in industries that need high temperatures. And then, of course, there's the one everyone knows: incineration.
Right, just burning it. Isn't that bad for the environment, though, releasing all those pollutants into the air?
It can be if it's not done right. But modern incineration is really controlled. They turn the waste into ash, gases, particles, and heat.
So you can actually make electricity by burning waste, if you do it carefully.
Yeah. The goal is to minimize the environmental impact while getting as much out of the waste as possible. Now, there's one you might not know about: pyrolysis.
Pyrolysis. Never heard of it. What is that exactly?
It's a process that uses really high heat to break down waste, but without any oxygen. Imagine baking something at a super high temperature, but with no air. And the cool part is you get some valuable products from it.
Like what? What kind of stuff comes out of pyrolysis?
You can get bio-oil, which is a liquid fuel. Then there's syngas, which is a mix of gases mostly used for fuel. And finally, you get char, which is a solid leftover that's high in carbon.
It's amazing to think that instead of just dumping hazardous waste, we can actually turn it into useful stuff. It's almost like alchemy.
That's a great way to put it. How we handle hazardous waste has a huge impact on our planet and our health. It's
Right.
a field that's constantly changing, and for you UPSC folks, it's important to stay up to date. Speaking of which, there's another method that's getting more attention in India, plasma gasification.
Plasma gasification. Now you've got me really curious. What is that?
Imagine a torch, but superheated, hotter than the surface of the sun. That's what plasma gasification uses to break down waste at the molecular level. It's pretty new, but it has the potential to change how we deal with hazardous waste, especially in a place like India that produces so much of it.
It sounds like there's no single solution for hazardous waste. Every method has pros and cons, right?
Exactly. What method you use depends on what kind of waste you have, the infrastructure, even the cost. Co-processing might be great if you have a lot of cement plants, but plasma gasification might be better for super toxic waste that you can't dispose of safely any other way.
So for all the studying for the UPSC exams, what are the key takeaways here? How should we be thinking about hazardous waste management for the exam?
That's a great question. The Bhopal gas tragedy itself, that's a big one. You need to know what caused it, the impacts, both short-term and long-term, the legal and social fallout, and the lessons we learned about industrial safety and regulations. Bhopal is a classic case study in environmental disaster management and all the ethical and legal issues that come with it.
So it's not just about memorizing facts. We need to analyze, understand the complexity, see the bigger picture.
Exactly. The UPSC examiners don't want robots spitting out facts. They want people who can think critically, connect the dots, and form their own opinions about issues like this.
That's good advice.
Mhm.
You mentioned plasma gasification is a new technology. Are there any other new technologies or solutions for hazardous waste that we should know about?
There's a lot of cool research going on in this field. One promising thing is bioremediation.
Bioremediation. What's that?
It uses microorganisms like bacteria and fungi to break down or neutralize hazardous substances. It's more natural and sustainable than some of the older methods.
So instead of using harsh chemicals or extreme heat, we let nature clean up the mess.
Exactly. And the great thing about bioremediation is that it can work in a lot of different places. Contaminated soil, groundwater, industrial wastewater, it's pretty versatile.
This has been really insightful. I think the Bhopal gas tragedy is a powerful reminder about industrial negligence and the need for responsible hazardous waste management. But it also shows that it's not just about government and technology. It's about all of us and how we act.
I totally agree. It's about individual responsibility and companies doing the right thing. We all have a part to play in making things safer and more sustainable.
Well said. And for everyone out there studying for the UPSC, remember, the more you know, the better you'll do on the exam, and the better you'll be able to help prevent another Bhopal from happening.
Knowledge is power. Understanding these complex issues like hazardous waste management, that's how we build a better future.
This has been a really informative deep dive. We hope it's made you want to learn more. And if you like this episode, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. It really helps us out. Until next time, keep learning and keep asking the tough questions. All right, so we're wrapping up our deep dive into the Bhopal gas tragedy and all this hazardous waste in India. A lot to think about, right? The scale of it all, the different ways to get rid of it, all these new technologies popping up.
Yeah, no kidding. And for anyone out there prepping for the UPSC, this isn't just, stuff you need to memorize. This is about real problems, real challenges, the kind of stuff you might have to deal with as a policymaker someday.
Absolutely. So as we finish up here, what are the big takeaways for our listeners, especially those UPSC folks? How should they be connecting all this to what they might see on the exam?
Well, the Bhopal gas tragedy, that's a huge one. They could ask you to analyze how the government responded, whether the regulations were good enough, even come up with your own solutions for managing hazardous waste better.
So it's not just about the facts of what happened. It's about understanding why it happened, the consequences, and what we can learn from it, right?
Exactly. They want to see you think for yourself, connect the dots, make arguments, show you really get it.
It's been a really eye-opening conversation. I think Bhopal is a stark reminder of what can happen when industries aren't careful and the importance of managing hazardous waste responsibly. But it also shows it's not just about the government or fancy technology. It's about all of us.
Couldn't agree more. We all have a responsibility here, whether it's the choices we make as consumers, pushing for better policies, or even just learning more about this stuff and talking about it with others. Every bit helps.
For sure. And to all you UPSC aspirants listening, remember, the more you learn, the better prepared you'll be, not just for the exams, but for tackling these challenges in the real world and making sure something like Bhopal never happens again.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. Understanding these complex issues, that's the key to a better future.
We hope you found this deep dive informative, maybe even sparked your curiosity to explore this topic further. And if you enjoy the episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. It really does help us out. Until next time, keep learning and keep asking the important questions.